Okay, so this is the second part of the mass media, the state and the political process. We're on page 278. Hopefully this will be a little shorter than part one. So we're at the hegemonic view. Now remember again, this is a Marxist view. There are two Marxist views as far as mass media go. We have the mass manipulative view, which we talked about last time, and now we're going on to the hegemonic view. So where the mass manipulative view sees external agents as having the greatest influence in political reporting, the hegemonic approach argues that the bias that is evidenced in political reporting emerges as a result of the class culture of journalists and the news values which emerge from it. This is the main argument of the Glasgow University Media Group, GUMG, to be found in a series of books that have emerged since the publication of Bad News in 1976. Okay, so it's not to do with the ruling powers. It's to do with the class culture of the journalists, and therefore what they see as being important news to give across to people. So using content analysis, the GUMG argues that the reporting of industrial relations, for example, favours the employers over the employed. This can be found in the way journalists are willing to use information supplied by the employer's side in a dispute uncritically. The use of language that describes employers in a strike as making offers and pleas, while strikers make demands and threats. Interviews with employers in the calm of their office while strikers are shown shouting from the picket lines, and the continuous re-editing of footage that comes to only focus on one aspect of what actors in the dispute, such as politicians, have said about its consequences. In this way, it is the actions of the strikers rather than the employers which are seen as disruptive and unnecessary. Okay, so you can see the use of emotive language there. Remember, we've talked before about if I call someone a terrorist, is it the same as if I call them a freedom fighter? Do we suddenly look at them in a different way? Okay, so the GUMG are saying, look, this is what happens with the news. The journalists side with the people who are of the same class as them, and therefore they report more benevolently about them. The news becomes, in Stuart Hall's view, an open rather than a closed text, with events presented narrowly as facts and a true picture, rather than as what they are, a selective and partial account, revealing as much about the news values of the journalist as the story itself. Okay, so we're not seeing a completely true picture, we're just seeing what the journalists want us to see. Now, this is according to Stuart Hall. In this way, the news comes to articulate what Hall calls the dominant hegemonic position. News values appear as a set of neutral practices, but we also need to see formal news values as an ideological structure, to examine these rules as the formalisation and operationalisation of an ideology of news. These news values are central to the process of cultural reproduction, as they in turn help shape the dominant ideology and maintain the status quo. Okay, so remember, with the idea of hegemony, you have people who are in power, but they can be elected in or out of power. Okay, now to stay in power, therefore, the news can be used as a way, and the media can be used as a way of putting forward their views and showing that those people in power are right. And then, people will say, oh yeah, they're doing well, they're a good government, or, whatever else. And so it helps to keep them in power. The GUMG's view of broadcast television news has been criticised in detail by Martin Harrison. Writing from a largely pluralist viewpoint, he argues that the same accusations of bias that the GUMG makes can be made of their own research, in that their own method of content analysis was used selectively and unrepresentatively over short periods of time that do not fully reflect the overall presentation of news stories. This point is then countered by the GUMG, which points out that Harrison himself was helped and partly financed by ITN in his research. Moreover, many of the GUMG's findings contain generalisations that are not based on the evidence they collected, that this evidence is not in any case factual, and their own claims to objectivity is in fact a bias towards trade unions. The GUMG, he says, is unwilling to admit that management often feels itself to be unfairly portrayed in industrial disputes, and there is nothing in journalist news values that necessarily favours management over trade unionists. He also argues that there is nothing wrong in emphasising the effects of industrial action on the public, claiming that television is more productively considered not as essentially one-dimensional but as conveying a range of contradictory contentions and explanations, the site of ideological conflict rather than simply fostering a climate of conformity. Okay, so again, from this pluralist perspective, Martin Harrison is saying, look, TV shows you all the different things that are going on, so you understand what the issues are, and then you come to your own decision as to what you think or who you support. Okay, it's not down to just hearing one side. Okay, and he argues that in fact the information that the GUMG use is also biased and one-sided, and of course they then say, oh, you're being biased and one-sided. So, you know, they argue backwards and forwards with each other on this one. There are a number of criticisms of both the mass manipulative and hegemonic views of political reporting, given that both see the media's role as maintaining and reinforcing the status quo in society. In those countries where there is a state monopoly of the mass media and freedom of the press is suppressed, such as the former Soviet Union, the evidence is that news stories focus on good news stories, such as increases in industrial production or the opening up of new public facilities, rather than the focus on crime, violence or industrial unrest that characterise news output in Western democracies. The public, who have a sophisticated ability to decode and comprehend media conventions, do not see news output in the West as propaganda and would stop watching and reading if they did. Okay, so here's the biggest criticism of the mass manipulative and the hegemonic view, is that, hopefully those people watching it are intelligent human beings, and if all they thought they were watching was propaganda, they would stop watching it. So there is this belief that they are actually being told different views and being able to come to their own conclusion at the end of it, and that they are presented with the alternative viewpoints. One of the things I meant to say in the previous bit as well, when we're talking about disputes and the way that people are put forward, there's a very interesting letter I was reading that has just gone viral, in fact, where there are strikes at the moment in UK schools, and a father who had received a letter from school saying that he was being fined £60 because he wanted to take his child out of school for a holiday outside of the school holidays. And so the school wrote to him and said that, this disruption was bad for his child's education and therefore he was being fined. So last week there was a strike at his school, and the teachers took a day off and the school had to be closed because they were striking. They didn't take a day off, they were striking. And so he sent a letter to the head mistress and said to her that as his child's education was being disrupted and as she knew this was very bad for him, he was fining the school £60. Now, he only did it as a joke, but he was kind of pointing out how ridiculous it is that you follow a policy and then you don't actually follow it through all the way. Things like this parent actually posted the letter onto Facebook to show to some of his friends, and then his friends copied it, and it's gone viral. So we do have a much easier way now of being able to see different and alternative views on the internet, that maybe when this book was written weren't apparent things as well. So the role of the state in a mixed economy remains problematic for Marxist-inspired views of the mass media, as it is for wider views of politics and power. Many commentators are unwilling to accept the view that parastatal organisations such as the BBC are mouthpieces of the ruling class, particularly when a number of BBC documentaries and drama series, such as Panorama and The Place of Alan Bleasdale, have earned criticism from the political right for their alleged left-wing content. It is also a strong accusation to make of journalistic professionalism and integrity to portray their output as biased and monolithic in this way, when many of them see their own output as either balanced or often critical of big business or the government of the day. And newspapers in the UK are really happy to criticise fat cats and well-known political leaders. They love to criticise people the same way that they criticise famous people as well, celebrities for what they're doing. So a lot of journalists would say, hold on, what are you talking about? Of course we're not biased, we're scathing sometimes against one side, but that we think that's the right thing to do, to give people the opportunity to understand things. And often you will see in newspapers in the UK a column where they argue for something and then a different columnist who is arguing against it, and then people can draw their own conclusions. So journalists would say, oh, you really are questioning our integrity, we're doing a lot more than that. And people will quite openly say they are right-wing or left-wing in the way they do things. I mean, Spitting Image was really, really popular, and was an impressionist show where they had these rubber puppets of all the politicians of the time in the 1980s, and they used to say horrendous things about them, really, through the use of comedy. So it's very difficult to say that the media is manipulating in the way that Marxists would have us believe. Okay, let's look at the postmodernist view then. In 3 articles called "The Gulf War Will Not Take Place," "The Gulf War, Is It Really Taking Place?" and "The Gulf War Did Not Take Place," John Baudrillard gives a good illustration of the postmodern view of the relationship between the media and political reporting. Baudrillard highlights the virtual nature of the war between Iraq and the Western Allies in the Gulf in 1991. Thus, many of the actors in the war and its reporting saw the conflict through screens in the pilot's cockpit as they dropped bombs, for the war reporters there watching the images through cameras and televisions, rather than live with their own eyes, through to the viewers at home watching their televisions. Okay, and I don't know whether you ever think this. I often think if I'm at a concert and people are looking through their camera screens or videoing, they're not actually watching the concert. They're so busy taking pictures that they're missing the live action. And in this sense, this is what Baudrillard is saying. We lived the war through a lens, okay, rather than actually experience it. So did it really happen? This mediated view of the war becomes more real or hyper-real than the war on the ground experienced by the combatants suffering from Allied attacks. The experience of the war for everyone on the Allied side was by simulation of what was happening, or what he calls a simulacrum. There it is. Sorry. The conflict becomes no more real than a video game or Hollywood film, with footage presented from the nose cameras of missiles and relatively few images of the casualties and real horror and confusion of war. Our understanding of the world in a postmodern age is therefore limited to superficial access to televised news, which is read as a text of subjectively interpreted images and signs. These have become as much part of our reality as the world beyond that they can never portray. Okay, so what he's saying is we see this kind of sanitized version, and we almost think of it as being like a film that we're watching, and therefore we don't understand the atrocities that are actually going on in the war. We only see it from this sanitized perspective. Christopher Norris has been particularly critical of this view, arguing that Baudrillard and postmodernism are contributing to the Allies' aim of hiding the real nature of the war, when the American public is still having difficulty coming to terms with losses in Vietnam, where real people are killed by real munitions, as well as aiding the belief that it is no longer possible to say that, in absolute terms, an act is right or wrong. Baudrillard's views are at best controversy for its own sake, and at worst destructive of the possibility of peace or understanding. Okay, so Baudrillard is saying, look, what we're caught up in is this hyper-real, what is presented to us through the media, and we only see a sanitized version of things. Norris is criticising him by saying, look, actually what you're saying is we can never understand things properly because we don't see them properly. So that's actually very destructive, what you're putting forward, and it maybe you're supporting the politicians more than you realise by saying that the message they give is a better way for people to understand what's going on. I don't think that Baudrillard would be very happy with that interpretation of it. What he's saying is we have to snap out of being pulled in by the media and living in this world of fantasy and films and fiction, and actually understand the realities of life.